So the learning outcomes for this session, after the session, hopefully you'll be able to identify factors that influence and affect student mental health and recognize how they relate to academic performance. And we also want to help you identify strategies and approaches that help support students socially, emotionally, and academically as they strive to succeed in a challenging learning environment. So those are our two learning outcomes. The session scope, this interactive session explores sources of student anxiety and depression, specifically as they relate to the current pandemic and identity. We are in an election year, so this is kind of very highly charged. You will learn strategies and approaches that will enable you to help support students who may be struggling with their mental health and with academic learning. There will be a breakout room case study, and previous session feedback has said that participants have gotten the most out of that case study experience. So we do hope that you stay to participate in that. And then we will have a extended Q&A opportunity for you to kind of talk to either me, Brittany, or Iris about student mental health and how to support them in their kind of academic success. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Iris.
Yes, so today I'm going to be talking about some situations that are currently affecting our students as they try to navigate academics along with COVID-19, along with different identity-based concerns. Just so that, you know, as faculty and staff, you're aware of some of the challenges that our students are facing as they try to be engaged in their academics, as they try to be successful when it comes to academics. And so I am going to start off talking a little bit about COVID-19, since that's impacting us all in ways that you can support your students. And then I am going to transition over to talking about identity-based concerns. And these concerns are things that our minoritized students have been needing to manage for years, potentially their entire lifetime, but things have been heightened since this summer, with the murder of George Floyd and incidents that happened both before and after his murder. Other things that have been happening across the country this summer, and as Nate pointed out, as we go into the election in a few weeks. And so all of those things have heightened some of these identity-based concerns and their impact, and in turn, they're going to potentially impact academic success in your classes. And so I'm going to go ahead and start talking a little bit about COVID. And so talking about COVID, so we have been dealing with this now for about 7 months or so. And, having to confront the reality of COVID can have, an impact on people's mental health. But there are things that we all can do to help disrupt that impact. And so some of this information that I'm going to be sharing is in terms of our students, but it also is applicable to all of us as we try to navigate COVID. And so as you hear me talk about some of these things, you'll probably, see that a lot of these things sound familiar and that they may impacting you as well. And so in terms of the reality of COVID, we've been having to deal with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of instability, a lot of unforeseen changes. And I think that change is difficult for everybody, but I think it's even more challenging sometimes for young adults, for adolescents, to really manage those changes and their implications, their consequences. And so our students are having to really adjust to all of these changes in their lives, and that can prove to be difficult for them. And then a lot of our students are dealing with loss and grief. And so loss and grief related to the pandemic, potentially, COVID has impacted their families, their communities. They potentially know someone who has contracted the illness, maybe has perished from the illness. And so they're having to navigate loss and grief as they come back to school. Then there's also loss and grief related to finances. If their parents have lost jobs, if they themselves have lost their jobs, they may have a lot of financial insecurity right now and a lot of sense of loss and grief around that. And then there's also loss and grief around milestones. And so for a lot of our first year students, they had probably envisioned their high school prom, their high school graduation, new student conferences, fish camp to look so much differently than what actually happened. They may have envisioned their freshman year to be different than what is actually occurring. And there's a sense of loss and grief around those milestones of what they had envisioned, maybe K through 12, their entire K through 12 career, looking forward to prom and graduation, and that didn't work out as planned. The same can be said about our seniors and our former students who recently graduated. They had envisioned that senior year being so different, and of course the students in between and all the different milestones that have been needed to be adjusted or modified, and the loss and grief that comes with that. And on top of all of that, the physical distancing and isolation that we are all experiencing due to the pandemic. And isolation has been shown to be one of the symptoms or one of the contributing factors to depression. And so it's important that even though we're isolating and engaging in physical distancing, how to still remain socially connected with others. And so that is some of the reality of COVID that our students have needed to navigate for the last 7 months. And that can have an impact. So some of the potential impact could be feeling disconnected from your romantic partner, from peers if you're not in the same location, feeling disconnected from family, from community. And so just feeling disconnected, potentially feeling lonely. That could be because they live alone in their apartment. Maybe their roommate went back home and they're living alone. Or maybe you're just living with one other person or a small group of people that still makes you feel a little bit lonely and alone. And that can also make you feel bored, as well as have this fear of missing out, or FOMO as our students may be calling it. Fear of missing out in terms of, I'm back home with my parents, and am I missing out with my romantic partner, my friends, being back in Bryan College Station? Am I missing out because I'm taking online classes and my peers are there in person? Am I missing out because, I'm not engaging in the same activities that other people are engaging in? And so there's this fear that maybe our romantic relationship, our friendships are going to be damaged by COVID. We're not going to be as close. There's this fear that I'm not going to do as well academically because I'm not an online learner. There's this fear that I may contract COVID because I have to go to classes face-to-face, or I have to go to work and be there and engage with people face-to-face. So there's a lot of fear of the future. When is this going to be over? What other changes am I going to need to make? And so there are a lot of fears that our students are needing to manage right now due to COVID, and that can cause anger, that can cause frustration, feelings of helplessness, because we're feeling out of control, like not feeling like we have a sense of agency over our life because of COVID. And again, that can bring feelings of grief, of worry, of stress, that can become an anxiety disorder, that can become a major depressive episode. But we can disrupt that. And just 3 suggestions as to how we can do that. Connecting, and you will hear me talk about this repeatedly in the next 30 minutes, checking in and encouraging. And so really trying to connect with students. And how can you do that in class if you teach a class? Especially if you're teaching a class online. How can you create opportunities for your class to engage with one another? And so could you have more activities that, involve students through the chat box? Can you have activities that have breakout rooms, or just people engaging more by unmuting themselves? And so this may require you to change maybe your syllabus just a little bit to slow things down and allow more moments of connection in class. Can you also create group projects for individuals, not necessarily for a grade or for credit, but again, to have an opportunity for students to connect? And then can you continue to meet with students one-on-one? Can you maintain your office hours, or potentially increase your office hours so that you can connect with them? And when they stop by virtually or in person, checking in, just asking, how are you doing? You will be amazed how much that one question can do. Oftentimes we go about our lives and people don't ask us how we're doing. And the same thing is for our students. And so just asking, how are you doing? Listening to them, and then normalizing, validating some of their feelings around COVID. And you now have some idea of some of the, potential impacts, so you can normalize and validate those feelings. And then encouraging them to have a routine. So before COVID, we probably all got up, took a shower, got ready, ate breakfast, and we were out the door, went to campus, engaged with one another, had lunch with a friend. After classes, after work, we'd go to the gym, happy hour, things like that. And that routine is probably out the window for most of us, as well as for our students. And so how to encourage students to have a routine? Because again, a lack of a routine can contribute to depression. And so that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid students developing an anxiety disorder or a major depressive episode. And so encouraging a routine that may look different from the past, but encouraging a routine so that all the days don't blur together for folks, and encouraging self-care in that routine. And so the big three: diet, sleep, and exercise. How can you encourage students to have a healthy sleep hygiene, try to have as well of a balanced diet as they can, and then exercise. And then other forms of self-care. So it could be, some things that help reduce anxiety and stress, like knitting, adult coloring book, meditation, yoga, gardening, so many different things, encouraging students to have that variety, maybe resuming some old hobbies or learning new hobbies. And so really encouraging them to take care during this time. And again, all of these suggestions are probably going to be helpful for all of us as well to disrupt the impact of COVID. So all of us are dealing with COVID and its impact. And at the same time, our minoritized students are having to deal with additional layers, like I mentioned earlier. So due to their identity, due to systems of privilege, power, and oppression, our students who are in minoritized identities have needed to navigate additional challenges. They may have been navigating these challenges prior to COVID, but COVID just adds another layer, and then the things going on in our country over the last summer and then into this semester as well. And so I'm going to give some information about some of these identity-based concerns that our students may be struggling with, just so that you have some awareness. By all means, this is not exhaustive and comprehensive of everything that you need to know. This is just a starting point. Some of this you may already be aware of, and other things may be new to you, and you may be curious about learning more. And I really encourage you to do some more research, engage in conversations that can increase your awareness about some of the struggles our minoritized students are facing. And then after doing that, I will kind of connect these struggles to some mental health concerns that may arise and how that impacts academic engagement and success, and recommendations for how you can support students in terms of their mental health, with the goal of helping support them in terms of their academic success. So these are some of the identity-based concerns that are impacting our minoritized students at the moment. And so I'm going to start off talking about racism and how that's impacting our students of color, particularly our Black students. And so like I mentioned earlier, in May with the murder of George Floyd, racial unrest, racial protests, the fight for racial justice, this has been going on at a national level, state level, local level, and on campus. And it does have an impact. Systemic racism has an impact in terms of intergenerational trauma, community trauma, racial trauma. It impacts mental health. And so we need to be aware of the experiences of our students of color and how they are navigating those challenges around racism. We've seen the hashtag hate is the hidden core value. There are other hashtags. So if you haven't gone to Twitter and read what some of our students have been posting, I encourage you to do so, just so that you have an understanding of some of their experiences and some of their challenges, and how they feel like the university has not really reacted in a way that they feel would have been supportive. And so again, this is just for you to have more of an understanding of some of our students' experiences around racism. In terms of our Asian American and Asian international students, they may be navigating xenophobia, nativism, and racism related to COVID. There has been out there in social media, in the media in general, some conversations about COVID being related to the Chinese community and being called the China virus. And that has resulted in some violence towards people who are perceived to be Chinese or Chinese American. That has resulted in physical violence, in verbal violence, and emotional violence. And some of our students who are Asian American or Asian international students have encountered these experiences. We have learned that our students have had these experiences. So it's not just hypothesizing whether they have or not, but they have. And some of these students may be in your classroom, or you may be advising these students. And so again, knowing that they may be navigating xenophobia, nativism, and racism right now. For our undocumented, documented students and our students with mixed status families, they are having to navigate anti-immigration sentiment and nativism and a lack of comprehensive immigration. Earlier this summer, the Supreme Court ruled that DACA was not going to be dismantled, but that is a constant threat for our undocumented students. And so living with that stress, with that worry, with that anxiety of not knowing what's going to happen, with that uncertainty, all very similar to everything I talked about regarding COVID, that's just another layer. And so imagine trying to really sit in class and study and engage academically when you have all of this anxiety about just being able to be present, in your classroom, wondering whether you're going to be deported or your family's going to be deported. And so there's a lot of, stress that some of these students are undergoing. For our LGBTQ plus students, some of our students are back home in non-affirming environments, or even here in Bryan College Station in non-affirming environments, and having to deal with the impact of homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and related normative systems of hetero and cis normativity. And so for those of our students who are back home, maybe they're not out to their family, and so they're having to hide that part of their identity. Maybe they were out here at college and they had a support system here, and now they don't have that support back home. Or maybe some of these students were out to their families and their families weren't very supportive. And so they're in an unsupportive environment, maybe listening to their parents say negative things about their identity. And so, some of the things that our students are navigating right now because of COVID that kind of intersects with their identity. In terms of our international students, again, the impact of COVID as well as xenophobia and nativism, right before the fall semester started, there was this fear that students could be deported or asked to leave the country if they did not have enough face-to-face classes. Now there's conversations about changing some of the guidelines for their student visas. And so again, that increases anxiety, stress, paranoia, and that really gets in the way of students being academically present. Then we can also think about students with disabilities and the challenges related to accessibility in general, but also heightened by COVID. And for our religiously diverse students, also continuing to deal with anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Earlier this summer, anti-Semitism was again in the news. And so, it continues to come up. It's been coming up for probably the last 4 years, and that impacts our religiously diverse students. And so again, this is just a quick overview, just to give you a quick snapshot of what some of your students may be dealing with. So some of these, identity-based concerns can have an impact on mental health. And so I'm going to be talking about some of that, but I want you to really be aware that this is a continuum, and not all identity groups and not all individuals have to confront some of these mental health concerns. So it varies by identity group, and then it varies by individual within those identity groups. Some identity groups, some individuals have more protective factors than others, and those protective factors can help guard you or protect you from some of these mental health concerns. Some of the protective factors are having community support, familial support, faith, resilience, and grit. And so I think at the very least, students in these identity groups are going to be experiencing some stress. I mean, it's hard not to feel stressed by everything that's going on in addition to COVID. That stress, that worry can then become anxiety. And so what is anxiety? What does anxiety look like? And so anxiety has both cognitive as well as physical manifestations. And so cognitive manifestations of anxiety are, for example, ruminating about the past and what I could have, should have done, and really finding it hard to let go of something that happened, and you're engaging in this self-blame, in this guilt, in this shame. And so that is part of anxiety, that ruminating. And then you can also be obsessing about the future and what you need to get done and how are you going to get all that done. And it can become an overwhelming sensation. It could just snowball into something bigger and bigger, like a panic attack. And so having these obsessive, intrusive thoughts that you cannot stop. And so you're either thinking about the past or you're focusing on the future, but you're not really present. In terms of the physical manifestations of anxiety, and more than likely with panic attacks, is probably having some nausea, having difficulties breathing, having your heart beating faster, having your mind racing, feeling like you have an elephant on your chest, maybe a lot of tearfulness, a lot of crying, maybe pain down your arm. So many times our students go to the ER thinking they're having a heart attack, and all the, everything is done, all the work that needs to be done at the ER, and then they're told it's really a panic attack, it's anxiety. And so, this is how intense anxiety can become, that it can mimic the symptoms of a heart attack. Now, if you're having some of these symptoms, I'm going to encourage you to still go get checked out and not just assume that it's anxiety, but don't be surprised if it is anxiety, and really, looking at your environment and what's going on for you or for your students. In terms of depression, it's a constellation of symptoms that people feel most of the day, most days, for more than a 2-week period. Because we all feel depressed once in a while. We all feel down in the dumps for a day or two. That doesn't mean that we have clinical depression. That doesn't mean that we have a major depressive episode. It really has to be most of the day, most days, for more than 2 weeks. And some of the symptoms that our students may be experiencing are changes in sleep pattern. So they're either sleeping more or less than before. It could be changes in the appetite, either less or more than before. It could be lower motivation, lower ability to concentrate, more tearfulness, or on the other side of the spectrum, apathy and not really caring or having much emotion. It's not really enjoying things that they used to enjoy. It's being more irritable, having a shorter fuse, feeling sad, fatigued, helpless, hopeless. So a lot of those symptoms together, like I said, most of the day for most days for over a 2-week period, can constitute a major depressive episode. And then trauma symptoms, like I mentioned earlier, systemic racism can result in racial trauma. A lot of the things that our LGBTQ plus students experience can also be considered traumatic. And so some of our students may have PTSD-like symptoms, and sometimes they may be triggered in your class. And so our students may be dealing with a lot. And sometimes the way that they try to manage the stress, anxiety, depression, trauma symptoms is with substances. And that can become substance abuse or even dependency. And so all of this can then contribute to feelings of shame, worthlessness, hopelessness that can result in self-harming ideation or behavior, as well as suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts, and completed suicide. And so that's why it's important to be aware of the impact of discrimination and oppression on our students. Again, I'm not saying all of your students who have minoritized identities are going to be experiencing this, but I just kind of wanted to give you a snapshot of what is on that continuum in terms of mental health impact. So then I want you to consider Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how difficult it is for students in minoritized identities to meet some of those basic needs. If you're not sleeping well, if you're not eating well, you're not really meeting your physiological needs there at the bottom of the pyramid. If you're feeling unsafe, whether it's physically unsafe, emotionally, psychologically unsafe, you're not meeting safety needs. If you're not feeling like you belonged at a predominantly white institution that is hetero and cis normative, that is Christian centered, you don't feel like you belong. You're being given messages by peers that you don't belong because of your minoritized identities. You're not fulfilling that belongingness and love need. And then all of that can impact your self-concept, self-esteem, self-confidence, self-worth, and you're not meeting the esteem needs. So some of our students are not having a lot of their 4 basic needs met. Then if you see in the middle of the pyramid, that's where it's the need to know and understand, which is what we do in college. That's, the need to look at aesthetics and beauty. And then at the top of the pyramid is self-actualization and transcendence. But we're looking at students struggling to meet those 4 basic needs as they're trying to navigate academics. We're not saying that we all have to have all of those 4 needs met before we can engage academically, but we're saying that, it does impact, especially if in all of these 4 areas, you're not having needs met. It then becomes difficult to go to class. It becomes difficult to be present in class and engage in class, do the homework, study, and do well on exams. And so this can result in a student doing poorly in a class, being on academic probation, realizing that they need to withdraw for the semester, or being suspended by the university. And all of this then in turn impacts, our students, and there are lower persistence, retention, and graduation rates for those students in those minoritized identities. So just really for you to think about how this is all related, how students' identities and the oppression, discrimination they may feel impacts mental health, impacts needs not being met, which then impacts academic engagement and success. So what is it that you can do to support students in terms of their mental health so that in turn they can then do well academically? So again, I bring up connection. Connection, I really believe, is key. So you can connect by starting to contextualize students. I think sometimes we see students kind of like in a vacuum, like they're just students and they're just here to study and that's it. But students have a lot of different roles, a lot of different identities that impact their ability to be present academically. And so how can we go about thinking of our students in a more holistic way and understanding that they have different roles, different identities that are impacting their role as students. And then acknowledging, recognizing, the impact that they may be experiencing due to some of the things that are happening, currently in our country, in our state, on our campus. And can you listen to them share these experiences? Can you listen to their narratives? And can you try to validate their experience and their feelings, even if you don't fully understand what they're going through? Because maybe you do not share that same identity and you want to understand, but you still don't feel like you're understanding completely. Can you validate even if you do not fully understand? And then can you seek to understand? Can you hold on one hand your own experience, your own perspective, your own worldview, and on the other, can you hold your students? Can you really hold their experience, their perspective, their worldview, and can one not negate the other? Can you hold both? And that can be really hard when we're used to just, holding our own. But can you challenge yourself to grow in that way and hold both, your own values and perspectives in your worldview, as well as your students? And then can you show empathy and care to your student as they navigate these challenges? I can assure you, if you connect with students in this way, there is a high likelihood that your student is going to feel seen, heard, and valued by you. And that is big because a lot of students with minoritized identities feel like they're invisible, feel like they don't matter, like they're not valued by the university. They're not valued by us as faculty, staff at the university. And so you trying to connect can be so powerful, so meaningful to that student. Please do not underestimate the impact and value of connection, of micro affirmations and micro validations that you may think this is really simple. How is this going to make a difference? Again, if the student feel like no one ever reaches out to them, if a student feels like they're never seen or valued and you reach out to them and just try to connect, that can really make a difference for that student. That day, that week, that semester, that can really disrupt some of those things that I mentioned in terms of mental health and their potential continuum to self-harm and suicidal ideation. And so again, the power of connection is just unimaginable. And so try to connect with your students and then explore options with them. So if you're struggling to meet basic needs, it's going to be really hard to brainstorm and explore my options, do research about what are additional options, and then problem solve. It's hard to do all that. We don't have the emotional or physical energy to do that when we're in that place of unmet needs. So if you are at a place where you do have more physical and emotional energy, can you then help students explore their options? If they're struggling in your class, can you explore options of how they can complete your coursework, extra credit work, etc.? If they're struggling in another class, in another department or college, can you help them explore their options? If they don't have food to eat, there's food insecurity, can you help them connect to the 12 can pantry or other places where they need resources? And you may have to do some of this research because maybe you do not know about 12 can or other resources on campus, but do you have some time that you can invest in doing this research, sharing that information with the student, and helping them problem solve with the intention that this will then help them be more academically engaged and more academically successful. It is important as you do this to really know your limitations, your personal and your professional limitations. And we all have different limitations. It depends on our personal experiences. It depends on the education we've had, our different fields. It depends on trainings that you've had. So if you've had the Aggie Allies training, the bystander intervention training, Cognito, QPR, which is through our suicide awareness and prevention office, then you may feel like you can go a little bit more with students versus if maybe you haven't had some of the training. And so really knowing where your limitations are personally and professionally, and knowing when to refer. And when you refer students to someone else, I want you to think about safety risk. Does the student have safety risk or not? Is it low or is it high? And so if a student is talking about self-harming or taking their lives, suicidal ideation, that is a high safety risk. If a student is not talking about that and they're just struggling, then we can assume at that moment that they're at a lower safety risk. If they are at a low safety risk, then you can refer them to departments. You can refer them to financial aid, student assistance services, CAPS, the helpline, because they're at a low risk. Once you start to question whether they're at a low risk or not, maybe they have been a little gamey, they maybe haven't really said, I'm intending on harming myself, but you're kind of wondering, that may be the time to consult. And so calling CAPS and consulting with a counselor about the situation, or submitting a Tell Somebody report and saying in the report that you're not quite sure whether you should be concerned or not, but you're kind of wanting to check in. Submitting that Tell Somebody report is going to trigger a university response, a team to go out and check on the student and connect them with more resources. And so if you're ever in doubt, submitting that Tell Somebody report to get more support and assistance. But if the student has mentioned self-harm and suicidal ideation, really thinking about calling 911 and asking for a wellness check to make sure the student is okay, and really not waiting to submit that Tell Somebody report or to contact CAPS, like it's more immediate. And so calling 911 in that moment is really important. In terms of some of the resources that CAPS has around diversity and inclusion, I just wanted to highlight a few of them. This is our landing page on the left. Towards the middle of the page, we have a statement about racial trauma is real. And then we have several buttons. We have a button that goes to our microaggressions page that defines microaggressions and how to manage microaggressions that you've experienced. We have another button on xenophobia and racism around the coronavirus that talks more about normal reactions to xenophobia and racism and ways to manage that. And then we have a button that goes to our resource page for students of color, which is what you see on the right. And that has some resources that students can connect through our website, and then some toolkits on how to manage the impact of racial trauma. And so you'll see like a racial trauma is real toolkit, a loving kindness meditation for oppressive experiences, a one-page toolkit on surviving and resisting hate, and then a more holistic perspective on navigating racial trauma with the 4 Bodies toolkit. And I encourage you to really navigate these pages that we have at our website and really get to know some of these resources, because that is really more meaningful to students. You saying, hey, I know that they have this resource. Let's get on CAPS's website and look at it together. That's more meaningful than you saying, why don't you go to the CAPS website and look at their resources? Like, again, like that connection, that if you're walking them through it, there's more opportunity for connection. We do have a diversity and inclusion landing page. Going back to the image on the left, at the very top, you kind of see like 3 students with their shorts. Above them, there is a diversity and inclusion link, and that opens to this landing page. And towards the bottom, you will see buttons to different pages that we have for LGBTQ+ students, students of color, international students, undocumented, documented students, and students with disability. These pages have a lot of resources. So again, I encourage you to review some of this information that could be helpful. Further up on this page is our link to our Let's Talk program. And so our Let's Talk program is an outreach diversity initiative. And so this is the space where students can just come and talk about, stressors in their life, stressors related to identity and academics and family and COVID. And so it's not counseling. It is just a place to be heard, to be given a different perspective, some guidance, some resources. If the Let's Talk counselor thinks that a student does need counseling or crisis services, they will refer them to CAPS for more support. But sometimes all we need is that listening ear. We don't need counseling. We don't need a formal treatment plan. And so that's what Let's Talk is. Prior to COVID, this was a drop-in program that we had at the LGBTQ+ Pride Center, at the Department of Multicultural Services, and at International Student Services. With COVID, we have had to transition to a virtual platform, and students do need to go in and sign up for a slot to talk to a Let's Talk counselor. And so this is a virtual space for LGBTQ plus students, students of color, and international students that we offer at CAPS. So it's our Let's Talk program. I also wanted to highlight these videos that we have on different mental health concerns like anxiety, depression, worthiness, accepting emotions, relationships. These are based on workshops that we provide. When COVID happened back in March, we had no idea that we were going to be doing workshops online. And so we recorded our workshop material into these videos. And so these are now self-help resources that students can just watch all of the anxiety videos, learn more about anxiety and how to manage anxiety, depression, etc. Students, if they want to attend workshops, they can. We're doing them through Zoom. And so the workshop is if they do want to engage with the facilitator and other peers, but if students really just want access to the information, they can check out these videos online. More suggestions for how you can support students. One is educate yourself and do your own work. You know, watch the news and consider how your students may be impacted. Now, I'm not saying watch the news all the time because that's not healthy, but just know what's going on and how that could impact your students, and then acknowledge this impact and create an opportunity for connection. And so what would it be like for you at the beginning of class to just say, hey, I know this is going on in the world, in our country, and I know this may be impacting some of you, and I just want to invite you to come talk to me during office hours. And so some of you may be like, Iris, you're crazy. I don't want to do that. You're having a lot of anxiety right now, just thinking about it. And so I definitely understand, especially if you don't have experience talking to students who are potentially in distress. And so I have a couple of trainings that you can do to help you out in building skill and confidence in talking to students with distress. We have our Cognito program and our QPR program through our Suicide Awareness and Prevention Office. And Cognito is a virtual simulation. It's kind of like a video game. You have an avatar and there's a student avatar in the video game, and you're supposed to practice saying things to the student in distress. And if what you say the student doesn't like, they will walk out of the room. And so it gives you kind of feedback in the moment as to whether or not what you said was the most helpful thing or not for that student. And so Cognito may be something that you would want to try. And then our QPR training that we have been doing for more than 30 years, which is question, persuade, and refer when students are experiencing suicidal ideation. So just some things that may help you feel a little bit more prepared if you do want to create opportunities for connection with students. Then I also encourage you to develop awareness about yourself and your own privileges, and own those privileges and use it to support your students. And the last thing that I want to mention is the importance of you yourself engaging in your own self-care and self-preservation. You know, acknowledge your own intersectionality and marginalized identities if you have those marginalized identities. And how are all of these things that are going on in our country impacting you? And then also reflect on your role or identity as an ally or an advocate, and how are you being impacted? And seek and accept support. And I think that's sometimes the hardest thing, for us to acknowledge that we need support and then to seek it and accept it. And so really encouraging you to think about that. And that could be seeking support from a peer, from a supervisor, from a friend. If you are part of a religious community, from that religious community, from a therapist, so many different places where you can seek and accept support. And then the last thing, to kind of bring everything full circle, seek and build connection for yourself. That is important. We cannot be an island. We really need to be connected with one another as we ourselves try to navigate COVID and some of these identity-based concerns, and as we try to help our students navigate it. So again, please consider the importance of connection as you're trying to navigate these difficult times. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris. We are entering more of the case study application part, but I did want to revisit something that Iris had said really quickly. We're saying that you probably need to kind of build a relationship with your students, but we've had some questions about how do you set appropriate boundaries. So what I did was I called one of the system lawyers at Texas A&M System and just had an honest conversation. And this is sort of what our conversation boiled down to. Now, we advocate that you kind of build personal relationships with your students, you have empathy, but there are things that we can't go past. So one of the first things that we talked about was to remember your primary role at the university and to leave it to licensed medical, mental health professionals, even if you have some training when it comes to students' mental health. So I found the QPR training and the Aggie Allies training to be very helpful, but that doesn't qualify me to be a licensed medical or mental health provider. So that can help me empathize with students and show a caring, perspective to them, but it doesn't give me the skill set to kind of help with their mental health. Again, it's important to recognize that our job is not to quote unquote save a student or take them on as a quote unquote project. That came across pretty strongly in my conversation. It's also important to remember that our students are adults. We can't force medical or mental health care on adults because there is a different standard of care when compared to minors. Number 4 is we want to make sure that we're empathetic. We can care about students, but sometimes remember that the best way that we can care about students is to get them help. So the biggest takeaway for me was to refer. And as Iris had said, we could use the Tell Somebody app or application. We can also use any of the 3 things down here that I've kind of put in the phrasing. It sounds like you're having to tell me something very serious. Please know if we continue this conversation, I may need to make a report. So that's the concept of being transparent and clear with students so that they don't tell you something and then you have to retroactively say, well, sorry, I got to report it because that kind of breaks down the trust. And what you can follow that up with is, I'm not an expert in mental health or anxiety, depression, but I know people who are. Let's make the call together. Or let's get you some help. Let's make the call together. Or let's even walk over to CAPS together. Now, these situations were, for the most part, the more serious side of what Iris had saying. So the threat of self-harm, severe anxiety, depression, or the threat of violence against oneself or other people. So hopefully that never gets to that situation. But even when we're trying to, support our students, we never want to go too far and, try to save a student or get too buddy-buddy with them. Because remember, our primary role, if we're not a licensed medical health professional, is not to provide those services. So I just wanted to kind of reiterate that because there was a little bit of concern in our first time we did this earlier in the semester. But yeah, thank you, Iris, for providing all of those excellent resources. Now we are going to